What's good, YouTube? It's me, Squid, back in their video. Pure Snake Eyes versus Fire King Snake Eyes. Which one is a better deck? Obviously, both of these decks are very powerful. And it seems after the first weekend, post-Final release with the premier events that we had so far, both decks are doing a huge number of damage on the actual format. So I kind of want to talk about the pros and the cons in this video about each deck so you guys can make an educated decision and, you know, pick up whichever you want to play. Here's some pros and cons between the Snake Eyes Fire King deck and the pure Snake Eyes deck. So starting off, we really need to go over the end boards for each deck. The Snake Eyes Fire King end board is something along the lines of this, where you have the island on the field, everything's sort of established. Sometimes you have the Sanctuary on the field as well, depending on whether or not you sent it off of a Snake Eyes effect. You have the Appaloosa with multiple negates, and a Swarm Ship Will. So kind of similar to the simple Spoil Snake Eye end board. But the only difference is you do have much more plays in your graveyard. You have a loaded graveyard. Additional to Princess is actually the Sacred Fire King Garunix, who can trigger and bring himself back, then Foolishing a Kieran from your deck, and then special summoning a Fire King using the effect of Kieran to pop a card as well. So Kieran kind of adds an additional layer of disruption here, being able to be destroyed off of Garunix constantly. You also open up access to other disruptions like Fire King Avatar Arvada, who can destroy another fire monster to negate the activation of an effect, whereas the pure Snake Eyes cannot actually do this. This is very handy to defend against a lot of things like hand traps or potentially Nibiru. It's just a very nice card. You see that the ceiling for the Fire King deck is definitely a lot higher, I would say. You have a lot more resources and stuff to kind of rely on, in addition to just the Snake Eyes stuff. You can also end on some flexible end boards depending on the matchup. You can obviously have Snake Eyes Flamberg Dragon with IP Masquerena in the skill zone as well to bring back. Kind of borrowing a vein from the pure Snake Eyes deck, which typically ends on end boards that does have Flamberg on the table to special summon either IP Masquerena or another monster. So yeah, there's some flexibility as well in the Fire King build. Now, with the pure Snake Eyes build, you can actually take advantage of synchro monsters like Borreload Savage Dragon, as well as Formula Synchron, because of the fact that you can now play Jet Synchron, which is a level 1 fire monster tuner, instead of Ponix. Obviously, instead of going for Ponix line, you just summon out the Jet Synchron off of the original, and then from here you can make Formula Synchron, have the Borreload Savage Dragon in tandem with Witch being a level 7 monster, and then on your opponent's turn, what you can actually do after you use the effect of Snake Eyes Flamberg Dragon to bring back the IP Masquerena is you can use Formula Synchron's effect to actually synchro summon another synchro Baron de Fleur and have another Omni negate during your opponent's turn, as well as recur infinite resources with the Flamberg Dragon. Because this build does play multiple Flamberg Dragons, you always have one in rotation, so you can kind of use that to recycle through your resources and bring stuff back during your opponent's turn, as well as your own turn. So yeah, there's some key differences. I would say that Snake Eyes definitely is a lot better in the Omni negate department, whereas Fire King has more potential disruptions, but layered between the graveyard and the field and potentially, you know, in the hand as well. But pure Snake Eyes definitely has a little bit of an edge in terms of Omni negates, because you can actually negate hard, high impact cards like Branded Fusion, Triple Tactics Talent, whereas Fire King kind of has to play through them. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of each deck, starting with Fire King. Obviously, we kind of went over this. You have a lot of cards in the graveyard that you can take advantage of. Sacred Fire King, Garunix, and Kieran are just so versatile. Kieran being able to non-target pop a card is so degenerate, because you can actually pop back row as well as monsters, so it always kind of has the threat. And the fact that Kieran can actually turn off your Promethean Princess, which locks you out of monsters other than fire monsters. This is actually a big deal, especially because one of the most high impact hand traps in the game right now is none other than Nibiru the Primal Being, who actually has to be special summoned. And while you control Promethean Princess that's special summoned from your graveyard to disrupt your opponent's cards during their turn, you actually just cannot activate Nibiru. So having Kieran to pop your princess on demand at any point in time so you can then Nibiru is actually huge. Not to mention you actually are able to manually trigger the Amphibious Swarm Ship Will, because this card allows you to destroy a card on the field non-targeting when a link 3 or lower monster is destroyed. So you can actually use the Kieran to just pop your princess and then banish the Will and then destroy something. Whereas in the pure build, you actually cannot do that. If the princess actually hits the table, you might be hard-pressed to remove your own princess, because that locks you out of Nibiru completely. Now, the other nice thing about the Fire Kings is that they're basically extenders. Like Fire King Island, Fire King Garunix, this whole line is an additional power play in addition to essentially the Snake Eyes stuff, right? So you can play into your opponent's entire board with the Snake Eyes stuff that they're really good at doing. And then at the end of it, let's say you get nibbed when you already have the OTK off of the Snake Eyes stuff with Zelantis, you can just activate the Fire King Sanctuary into the island, and then from there just start going off into your Fire King plays, because this just guarantees that you have minimum 2 bodies or 3 bodies, depending on whether you're popping the fire monster from your board or from your hand, right? Because you'll always special summon the Garunix that you search, and then you dump either Arvada or Kirin to special summon back whatever bodies in your graveyard, probably the Ponix. That puts 2 monsters on the field. So going into Hida, you can obviously link climb and just go into tremendous boards just off of the Fire King stuff if you have a loaded grave and it's kind of like a mid-game state. So that's just what I really like about the Fire King stuff, and the fact that Kirin is a card, Garunix is a card, and then on top of that you also have Arvada, who is a very nice card that allows you to negate monster effects. Sometimes you can use him as your 5th summon so you don't play into Nibiru as hard, and then on top of that he can actually resurrect link monsters as well, including Doolittle Chimera, which means that you just get a free extra body because you're reviving a link monster by destroying the Arvada instead of just reviving a regular monster. Then on top of all that, you just have a lot of more options as well. If you have the choice of playing Garunix Entity as well as an additional disruption, if you happen to have the Sanctuary on board, whereas the Pure Snake Eyes just doesn't have this option, right? So I would say there are more disruptions in the actual Fire King Snake Eyes deck if you go full combo off of one Snake Eyes Ash, just because of Garunix and Kirin and potentially Garunix XCs or whatever else you have. You also have a lot better follow-up and potentially a better grind game because of the Fire King cards just being an extra engine in addition to what you have. The other nice thing about Kirin is the fact that it's a quick effect in hand, allows you to dodge targeting removal or targeting interruption, right? So if you normal summon like a Snake Eyes Ash and your opponent imperms or veilers you, then you can easily chain a Kirin from your hand and then it loses a target so you can resolve your Snake Eyes Ash. So that's just another thing why Kirin I think comes in handy so much, just being such a nice little utility card in general. Next, let's talk about some of the cons of the deck. Predominantly Fire King Island. This is a card that stays on your field at the end of your combo, and unfortunately, this does have some implications. This card says if this face-up card in the field zone is sent to the graveyard or banished, destroy all monsters you control. Mandatory effect, so you cannot avoid that, meaning a lot of players are siding Cosmic Cyclone or any cards to get rid of the Fire King Island, which Regeki's your entire board. So if you have something like an Appaloosa that's chilling there, which doesn't really benefit from being destroyed, it's probably going to be a bad time when your opponent draws a Cosmic Cyclone and just wipes out your entire board. So that's kind of a liability. Other things are you potentially could brick a little more. I think the consistency is a little bit worse than the pure because you're playing cards like Kirin, and the Fire King cards are actually the worst cards in the deck. They're good when you get to play, when you get going with the rest of your Snake Eyes stuff, but just on their own, they're huge bricks. Like if you have multiple Fire King Avatar Kirin with no starters in sight, you're probably not playing the game. This guy doesn't really do anything. Cards like Runix don't really do anything unless you're already playing. Even Arvada is not that great of a draw, to be honest, unless you pair it with like Bonfire or some other way to play. So these cards are just not that effective. Then there's the potential of drawing multiple cards that you don't want to draw, like the Fire King Sanctuary, maybe with a Fire King Island, and it just kind of degenerates from there. So that's the main drawbacks I would say about the Fire King stuff. You're also not able to take advantage of cards like Divine Temple of the Snake Eye, because at the end of your Fire King combo, you do have to replace the Snake Eye Temple with the Fire King Island. So that's just something to be aware about as well. And of course, we took a look at the end boards. The deck does not have a lot of Omni Negates, or any for that matter. So against high impact decks like Branded, where they're just summoning Branded Fusion cards like Mirror Jade to banish your stuff, it's going to be a bit of a grind. Sometimes you just still lose even though you have your established board, because all of your interruptions are basically soft interacts, right? You're destroying stuff, and there are a lot of decks that don't really care about cards being destroyed. They just start playing and recursion, and you know, everything floats. So that's just another thing to be concerned about, the fact that you don't really have any Omni Negates against decks like this.
Really quickly, if you guys aren't already subscribed to the channel, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button at the bottom. It'll go a long way to support the channel. Other than that, thanks a lot for tuning in.
Now let's talk about the pure Snake Eye deck. This deck is, as we mentioned, a little bit more consistent than the actual Fire King deck, I would say. But in terms of non-engine, you're still playing about the same non-engine in both decks, about 19 to 20, depending on how many cards are in your deck. The issue with pure Snake Eyes is that you do have to play some other cards to make your deck a little more consistent, because you're not playing another engine. You're not going to be able to, play with that engine if you drew it. So you have to instead pad your existing engine with more consistency cards. So that means playing multiple copies of Black Witch, 3 copies ideally, just so you always have access to your engine. You're playing multiple copies of the original Simple Spoil Snake Eye as well, which sometimes can clog a little bit, especially if you draw it with multiple witches or multiple other cards. And you do have to play other cards like Snake Eyes Birch, which is just an additional extender. So these cards are effectively filling the slots of the Fire King cards that we're removing to play Pure. You do have a couple of bricks like Jet Synchron, which you just don't really want to draw because he doesn't really do anything when you open with them. And then your extra deck is obviously a lot more tight because of the fact that you're playing a bunch of Synchro monsters, right? But that being said, the deck itself does have a lot of other ways to shine. We talked about the Omni Negate stuff, a lot of different ways you can play the deck as well. Having a bunch of recursion off of your multiple Flamberg Dragons is really, really nice. And you can, of course, end your turn with Divine Temple of the Snake Eye on the board, which does a lot to put pressure on your opponent because you get to special summon back a monster when they commit to the board. So a lot of the end boards even have a Flamberg Dragon in the scale alongside the IP Masquerena, which means that your opponent, when they summon, you can then trigger the field spell to summon back the Flamberg Dragon. Flamberg Dragon's online, so he can then special summon back the IP Masquerena, giving you a plethora of monsters out of nowhere, effectively, right? So really, really nice. You can also play some other tech options. I know some people were playing Dramatic Snake Eye Chase, which allows you to place the Diabell Star in your Spawn Trap zone. Then you can use the effect of Black Witch when she's summoned to set the Sinful Spells of Betrayal Severa, which is effectively a negate. It gets to negate any face-up card on the field, a lot like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend. So it's really, really nice that you can kind of play around certain cards like Triple Tactics Talent or like Board Wipes, Cosmic Cyclone, so on and so forth, just by taking advantage of this toolbox engine that they have. The other reason why I quite like the pure Snake Eye build is the fact that you can actually play into cards like D-Shifter a lot better. What do I mean by that? Well, you actually play a lot more extenders that are built into the actual Snake Eye engine. So you're playing Birch, which means that anytime that you have Ash, you go normal summon Ash, summon the Populace under Shifter, and then as long as you have a way to either add the Birch off of, say, a Bonfire or anything else, you can then special summon that back. You can use two monsters to make first Linkuriboh, I guess, to get a Dark monster on the board, and then link off into the Dark Charmer to bring back that Dimension Shifter, and then from there, you're going to have 3 bodies on board, including the Dark, to make an Appaloosa, which is really, really cool, right? So having Birch in your deck allows you to make Appaloosa a lot easier, and then that's just really, really good against a lot of the shifter decks like Luanda Reese, and it could potentially even win you the duel. Like we saw in the UDS, in the Swiss rounds, Shuping Zhu was playing against Ryan Mikami, who's playing the Fluanda Reese deck, and he got shifted, and he still ended on like a Appaloosa plus an IP Masquerena, just using his extenders under shifter, and that was enough to win the duel. So it's just really, really crazy how this deck can play into Shifter a lot better. And also you don't have another engine that relies completely on the graveyard, whereas Fire King, you know, you just have to use the graveyard and you don't have Snake Eye Birch. So it's very, very difficult for you to actually assemble Appaloosa. Half the time, more often than not, you're just ending on an SP Little Knight using your Popflower and the Snake Eyes Ash in the actual Fire King build. Whereas now in the Pure build, we can do a bunch of different things. We can end on IP, SP, sometimes Appaloosa. There's just a lot of different ways that you can kind of play into Shifter in this deck, and it's a lot more resilient in that regard because you're focusing on the core Snake Eyes engine. You're playing multiple cards that you shouldn't be, like Flamberg Dragon in the Fire King deck, and then you're just doing what the deck does best, right? You're taking advantage of all the powerful cards. You don't really rely on the original resolving. You don't really need Jet Synchron to win. You can just win traditionally using your link climbing. And then, of course, you have the synchro stuff. So, yeah, that's about it in a nutshell. Which deck do you guys prefer? Personally, I'm still kind of leaning towards Fire King just because of the added benefit, the added ceiling from the Fire King cards, being able to pop with Kirin, being able to play through Nibiru. There's just so many added benefits, I think, to actually playing that engine, even though it's a little worse in terms of consistency and adding additional cards, another engine. But I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. I know the Pure Snake Eyes deck actually won the YCS 3v3 Costa Rica, so I just really want to see what happens in Vegas. But guys, let me know in the comments below, which deck are you playing and why? Which deck is better? Is there a clear-cut better one? Let me know. Other than that, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.